Hello and welcome to Politics here on France 24. François Hollande was said to be a president who did not know or care much about Africa. Well, 8 months after his election, he has already sent French troops to the Central African Republic, to Somalia, and of course to Mali. So is he, like his predecessors, victim of the so-called Françafrique virus, the name used to define the shady and troubled relationship between France and its former colonies in Africa? Or is he acting really differently and ushering in a new era? To discuss the issue here today, we have three eminent guests. The first one is Marie-Roger Biloa, who's the Chief Executive Director of the Africa International Media Group. Hello and welcome to you. Second guest today on the set is Yves Gounin, who was a legal advisor to the former president of Senegal, Abdoulaye Wade, and who is the author of a book in France. I'll translate roughly, France in Africa, the fight between the ancient and the moderns. And last but not least, Douglas Yates, professor of political science at the American University here in Paris and the author of The Scramble for African Oil. Last weekend, François Hollande lived what he described as, quote unquote, the most important day of his political life. He went to Mali, was greeted by lots of people there, and he delivered a speech in Bamako, the capital, in which he uttered words not often heard in the mouth of a French president, making a reference to the world wars.
I haven't forgotten when France itself was attacked, when it was seeking support and allies, when its territorial integrity was threatened. Who came along? Africa, Mali. Thank you, Mali. Thank you. Today, we're repaying our debt to you.
Marie-Roger Biloa, what do you think of the words and the tone of François Hollande speaking a few days ago in Mali?
You know, I just think that was a moment of grace in the relationship between Africa and France, between African countries, some African countries, and France. I think François Hollande was not expected to do something like that, to interfere in Africa, but I think he's not a dogmatic person, and I think to be a great politician, you need to respond to situations and not say, I don't do that, and it's a principle. And he has been called in, with insistence. And the whole thing is covered by the United Nations, and everybody is happy. So it's not something which is part of what they call Françafrique. There's nothing shady in it. It's a very clear situation. And I think people are very happy that he reminds of the time where Africans came to help France. Because I think today, what Africans are very unhappy about, especially those who live in France, is that sometimes they just look like being intruders in France, and that they don't have their place here, and that people don't remember where they come from. And this is a very, very great moment, and I think people were happy wide beyond Mali. I think whole of Africa were very happy about that.
Yves Gounin, you'll go ahead. You've worked in one of those countries with very close ties with France, Senegal, for a couple of years. And many French presidents before François Hollande have said this era of the Françafrique is over. Is it really happening, or is Mali maybe just an accident?
Yes, I wouldn't share this enthusiasm. It's not François Hollande who is interested in Africa. It's Africa and Mali that forced François Hollande to go to Africa and to be interested about it. I may sound a bit provocative or even paradoxical. I would say that Mali is not in Africa. What's going on in Mali has nothing to do with Françafrique and the shady and troubled eras you were mentioning in your introduction. Mali is the conjunction of three events who has very little to do with Africa. Jihadists from North Africa independentist Tuaregs and ammunitions and desperados coming from Libya. And France was forced into Mali, notwithstanding what's going on in the whole sub-Saharan African continent.
Do you agree with that Mali is maybe an accident and that the relationship continues, despite the fact that François Hollande, maybe we'll hear just François Hollande before I get to you. He went, his first visit on the African continent was back in October, and he delivered a very important speech in Dakar in Senegal, in which he announced that the old times were over.
That time of what was called before the Françafrique has ended. There's France, there's Africa, and there's the partnership between France and Africa, with relationships based on respect, clarity, and solidarity.
So Douglas Yates, this was of course before the intervention in Mali, but is what's happening now proof that he's actually doing what he said he would be doing?
Well, I think that is his intention. So I do believe honestly that he's not interested in getting his hands and feet stuck in the tar baby of Françafrique. And I also agree that Mali, although it was a French colony, is not really part of Françafrique. France never had a lot of economic interests there, and it had been a Soviet ally. Having said that, if you look at the so-called international coalition of forces, you'll see the largest contingents of troops come from Chad, from Idriss Déby. There's a country that remains part of Françafrique. That is a country whose currency is controlled by France, a country whose military, including the leader, was trained by France, a country where France has a permanent military base, and a country that also provides oil for French oil companies, and a leader who's involved in French Freemasonry, and all of the sort of networks are there. Another country, Togo, where you have a second-generation dictatorship, one of these family dynasties within Françafrique. Another one of the alliances are there. So it's not entirely absent. Having said that, I think that overall, the intervention in Mali is not a traditional Françafrique intervention.
Marie-Roger Biloa, I mentioned in the introduction, François Hollande also sent troops to the Central African Republic where there was a rebellion. France in the past has done this on numerous occasions. The excuse was always to protect French citizens and interests, but in effect, it often helped the regime who was there to fend off a rebellion. Do you think this was also different, that the French are now saying, okay, we're maybe protecting our citizens, but we're not interfering in internal affairs?
Yeah, this is very interesting. I feel François Hollande as a person is different. But what we see, he hasn't changed much. I mean, the troops based in Chad or wherever are still there, and he doesn't even speak about it, that he intends to change that. But I say, what I see is that he doesn't want to appear as somebody who doesn't like Africa or pushing it away. So we've seen François Hollande welcoming all kinds of head of state here, where we feel, wow, they are not so democratic.
At the beginning, he actually seemed to want them away, but
yeah,
we've seen
that.
Paul Biya of Cameroon, Idriss Déby of Chad that you just mentioned. They've been welcomed to the Élysée Palace.
So what I call the principle of reality. When he said France-Afrique is over, I was seeing Sarkozy saying the same thing when he came, and I feel like there's something strong about this history, about this system being there, which the incumbent president cannot really move away, and he will show his personal mark in special occasions like that. And I think François Hollande will not change much, and what you call Françafrique will still be there, but he will not have his hands in it, but system will be around.
I mean, Yves Gounin, one of the big part of Françafrique was not only that you had to have relationship with maybe people who were not exactly examples of democracy, but that's international relations, but also the idea that within the circles of power in France, especially in the presidential palace, you had so-called African advisors, Mr. Africa, and this has always been there. Is it still there? Can we still see a kind of African lobby that's maneuvering behind the scenes?
There is a lot of fantasy around this African lobby and around the cellule africaine, which was located at the Élysée. Let's go back in history. When Jacques Foccart arrived in 1958 with de Gaulle, there were 200 people working in the Secrétariat Général aux Affaires Africaines et Malgaches. That was the official name of the cellule africaine. But after times, the size of this bureau was reduced, and nowadays such things doesn't exist, for the better.
Do you agree, Douglas Yates? Or are still people, there's also go-betweens who provide advice, sometimes not officially? Do you think that there is a real change going on right now?
We've seen a reduction of formal positions in French government, that is in the Élysée Palace, whole ministries, like a Ministry of Cooperation that simply doesn't exist. So we've seen a change of
Ministry of Development, right?
Right, a Ministry of Development. So we've seen an institutional change where formal state actors are not as involved. However, what still continues are business affairs. And I think the privatization of a lot of state activities has carried over into Franco-African relations. If you're a French businessman, you have a lot of advantages operating in former French colonies. You speak the language, you have long-established relations, you understand the business climate, and you've got the backing of the French government and often of the heads of states of those countries. A lot of what we call Françafrique occurs in this kind of domain. It's offshore bank accounts in the Caribbean, it's semi-criminal activities, it's assassinations, things no one wants to own up to. On the other hand, when we do look at the formal African cellule, we can see François Hollande has not surrounded himself with experts. The people that he's placed in what were the key positions are not African experts. And so when the moment came to make a decision, he worked with his defense minister and he worked with the chief of staff, Edouard Guillot. And this was very much a military operation rather than one of those operations that was sent by a cellule who were trying to arrange and negotiate things.
And I think also I agree with the business side of the whole story, because what we see is that François Hollande seems to be very sensitive to business, to winning market shares for, and also that you have the businessmen, the company, the big companies, which are the one, I would say, influencing his policy in terms of whom do we have relationship with? Do I receive the head of state of this country and that? And the thing is that you see them pushing because they won a big contract. Like I think there was a contract in Cameroon where, the Cameroonian government wanted to give it to a Chinese company, which were a better deal. But now they pushed, and he came here and they got the contract, So these kind of things, he was welcomed at the Élysée, and then the French companies got the contract. So you see the kind of things you used to see before, they are still around, and François Hollande doesn't want to be an impediment to business and to the economy in a time of crisis in France.
Did you agree with that assessment that maybe private interests are still weighing on that relationship?
Yes.
Let me, if I may, come back to the differences between Hollande and Sarkozy. We have emphasized these differences. I would cast a different tone, saying that history should remind us that incumbent presidents are willing to get rid of the bad old habits and to get rid of Françafrique. That is what Mitterrand said in 1981, appointing Mr. Jean-Pierre Cotte, as a very young, pragmatic, modernist Minister for Cooperation. Sarkozy did the same. Before his very disputed topical discours de Dakar, he made a speech in Cotonou, which sounded very modernist. But after stepping over, after being in power, those presidents turned into ancient procedures. François Mitterrand recreated the cellule africaine with his own son, Jean-Christophe, Papa Madi. Sarkozy...
Daddy told me. That's how he was nicknamed.
And Sarkozy did the same with a speech in Dakar and with the middleman, Robert Bourgi. The question is, how will François Hollande behave? Will he keep his words and get rid of the old habits? Or will he do the same thing as his predecessor and
What do you think?
will he talk like a modernist and act like an ancient?
Very quickly, what do you think?
I'm quite confident because I think that the ancients are getting older and older and the biological solution will favor the moderns.
Do you agree, Douglas, that maybe the change of generation will make a new relationship easier?
It's clear that there's been a generational transfer, so that the kinds of people who had fought in the resistance with de Gaulle had a colonial history, they're gone, and there are younger people there. But what's so interesting with arguments of continuity and change is that individual actors who are making history don't make history in the circumstances that they prefer. François Hollande would have preferred in September to have sent in African troops and perhaps provided some background. And instead, what he found was he was forced to do something that resembled an intervention of Valéry Giscard d'Estaing. So I don't think he's in control. I think he can make some decisions and he can have intentions, but probably for now the mechanisms are in place and he's going to have to manage a French sphere of influence in Africa.
Very quickly, last words.
Very quickly, is that I think what Africans expect most now, what we mean the new generation, is really that those countries like France, like America, Barack Obama, for instance, help the societies to become democratic, to push towards democracy in the countries and to make pressure whenever necessary. That's what we don't see. And I doubt that François Hollande will be willing to do that.
Okay, we'll have to see how François Hollande deals with Africa in the future. Certainly a very intense and interesting relationship. Thank you very much to all of you, and thank you for watching this edition of Politics here on France 24. We'll see you next week.